Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that a single trade decision could determine the future of Canadian farming, the price of your next car, and Canada's very place on the world stage? And what if that decision pitted the nation's loyalty to its oldest ally against a pragmatic deal with its biggest rival? In the intricate and often turbulent theater of global trade, nations are frequently forced to navigate a precarious balance between strategic alliances and sovereign economic interests. For Canada, a country whose economic identity has long been intertwined with that of its superpower neighbor, the United States, this challenge is a constant reality. A recent development, however, has thrown this dynamic into stark relief, presenting Ottawa with a dilemma that is as much about national identity as it is about import and export statistics. A stunningly direct and public proposal from Beijing has cut through the noise of diplomatic rhetoric, offering a simple transactional solution to a painful trade dispute. China will remove its crushing tariffs on Canadian canola if and only if Canada agrees to scrap its own 100% tariff on Chinese made electric vehicles. This offer is not a backroom whisper or a veiled threat. It is a clear cut proposition that could simultaneously rescue a vital Canadian agricultural sector, revolutionize the nation's automotive market, and fundamentally redefine its place in the world, forcing a choice between continued allegiance to Washington's trade playbook and the forging of a more independent, self interested path. Now, this proposal laid bare by China's ambassador to Canada represents a pivotal moment in the country's recent diplomatic history. Its power lies in its simplicity and its public nature, moving a critical negotiation out of the closed door sessions of trade ministers and into the open court of public opinion. At its core, the deal is a straightforward quid pro quo. On one side of the ledger is the fate of Canada's canola industry, a cornerstone of its agricultural economy, which has been brought to its knees by punitive Chinese tariffs. These are not minor levies. They are restrictive measures designed to halt trade entirely, leaving Canadian farmers with silos full of a product they cannot sell to their largest international customer. The Chinese offer promises a complete removal of these barriers, a lifeline that would immediately restore market access and inject much needed stability back into the prairie provinces. On the other side of the ledger is Canada's policy on Chinese electric vehicles. In a move that mirrored the protectionist stance of the United States, Canada's previous government imposed a staggering 100% tariff on these vehicles, effectively banning them from the Canadian market. China's condition is the complete reversal of this policy. By agreeing to these terms, Canada would open its doors to a new wave of automotive technology, offering its consumers access to affordable, high quality electric vehicles that are currently unavailable. The significance of this proposal extends far beyond the immediate economic implications for farmers and car buyers. It is a direct challenge to the status quo of Canada's foreign and trade policy, which has increasingly operated in lockstep with Washington. For years, Canada has paid a price for this alignment, often finding itself caught in the crossfire of geopolitical tensions not of its own making. This offer from Beijing is a chance to break that pattern. It is an invitation to engage in bilateral negotiation based on mutual benefit, a diplomatic off ramp from a damaging and seemingly intractable conflict. The decision Ottawa makes will signal whether it is content to remain a loyal subordinate in America's economic strategy, or is ready to assert itself as a sovereign player capable of making decisions that serve Canadians first. To really understand the weight of the current moment, one must trace the dispute back to its origins, a series of policy decisions that now appear to have been profoundly short sighted. The conflict did not begin in Beijing with an act of unprovoked aggression. It began in Ottawa with a decision to mimic American trade policy without fully considering the unique consequences for Canada. The Canadian government's choice to impose a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles was not the result of an independent investigation or a specific threat to its domestic auto industry. Instead, it was a clear instance of policy contagion, an act of solidarity with Washington's escalating trade war with China. The United States had justified its own tariffs with allegations that the Chinese government was illegally subsidizing its EV manufacturers, giving them an unfair advantage in the global market. While these claims were asserted with confidence, they were presented without definitive proof, suggesting that the true motivation was less about fair trade and more about stifling a formidable competitor. The Chinese automotive industry has made remarkable strides, developing the capacity to produce high quality, technologically advanced electric vehicles at a price point that dramatically undercuts many Western manufacturers. These are cars that could realistically be sold in Canada for something in the range of 35 or 40,000 Canadian dollars, making EV ownership accessible to a much broader segment of the population. Canadian consumers stood to benefit immensely, as did the country's environmental goals. Yet, Ottawa chose to align itself with the American position, effectively closing the door on this opportunity. This decision to walk in lockstep with the US was a strategic gamble that failed to pay off. China's response was predictable and surgically precise. Rather than engaging in a broad multi front trade war, Beijing identified a point of maximum leverage: Canadian canola. China is the single largest importer of Canadian canola, making the industry acutely vulnerable to any disruption in trade. By targeting this specific sector, Beijing ensured that the economic pain of its retaliation would be felt deeply and concentrated in a politically significant region of the country. It was a classic example of asymmetrical response, and Canada, by following America's lead, had walked directly into the trap. And the fallout from this trade standoff, it's been severe and multifaceted, creating a lose-lose situation for Canada. The most immediate and devastating impact has been felt by the nation's canola farmers. The closure of the Chinese market was not a partial reduction, it was a near total shutdown. Rick White, the president of the Canadian Canola Growers Association, has described a grim reality on the ground. Prices have collapsed, storage bins are overflowing with the recent harvest, and the shipping routes that once bustled with activity have gone silent. For an industry that had become a national success story, this sudden market collapse is an existential threat. Farmers who once planned for expansion are now struggling to pay their bills, and the financial hardship is rippling through rural communities that depend on the agricultural sector. The Canadian taxpayer is also burdened as the government is pressured to provide subsidies to offset the losses, effectively paying to mitigate the damage of its own foreign policy decision. Simultaneously, Canadian consumers are paying a different kind of price. The ban on affordable Chinese EVs means that the dream of owning an electric vehicle remains out of reach for many middle class families. While other Western nations, including the United Kingdom, Australia, and many countries across Europe have seen their markets flooded with innovative and cost effective Chinese EVs, which have become top sellers in some regions. Canadians are left looking on from the sidelines. The domestic market is dominated by more expensive models, slowing the transition to green technology and forcing consumers to pay a premium for political allegiance. This situation underscores a painful irony. A policy ostensibly designed to protect the domestic industry has instead harmed domestic consumers and undermined national climate objectives. Perhaps the most frustrating dimension of this crisis is the flawed and one sided nature of the U.S. alliance that precipitated it. In exchange for its loyalty, for backing Washington in its aggressive stance against China, Canada received no tangible benefit. On the contrary, it found itself targeted by the very partner it sought to support. The Trump administration, in its sweeping protectionist push, did not hesitate to slap Canada with its own tariffs on key commodities like steel and aluminum. It was a stark lesson in real politic, in the game of America first. Even the closest of allies can become collateral damage. Canada was dragged into someone else's trade war only to find itself bleeding economically while the instigator offered no protection and, in fact, inflicted additional wounds. This experience has laid bare the urgent need for Canada to diversify its trade relationships. The once stable and mutually beneficial partnership with the United States has become unpredictable, forcing Canada to confront the reality that it must cultivate other global connections, including with China, to secure its economic future. This complex web of consequences raises a critical question that extends beyond mere economics, touching upon Canada's very conception of its role in the world. The geopolitical landscape of the 21st century is fundamentally different from that of the 20th. The unipolar moment has passed, and a new multipolar world is taking shape, characterized by competing centers of power and influence. For a middle power like Canada, this new reality demands a more sophisticated and agile foreign policy. The strategic simplicity of tethering its national interests exclusively to a single superpower is no longer viable. To thrive, Canada must learn to engage with multiple major players, including China, not as a subordinate, but as a sovereign equal pursuing its own distinct objectives. This does not mean abandoning its long-standing alliance with the United States, but rather augmenting it with a pragmatic, clear-eyed approach to the rest of the world. It is about building a foreign policy of balanced engagement, where decisions are made in Ottawa based on a calculus of Canadian interests, not as a reflex to pressure from Washington. Of course, any pivot towards pragmatic engagement with Beijing is fraught with domestic political risk. Critics will inevitably frame such a move as a concession, raising legitimate concerns about national security, human rights, and the dangers of economic dependency on an authoritarian state. These concerns are valid and must be part of any national conversation. However, they cannot be allowed to paralyze Canadian policy, leaving the country trapped in a posture that actively harms its own citizens. The challenge for Ottawa, therefore, is one of narrative. The government must frame this decision not as a choice between Washington and Beijing, but as an unequivocal choice for Canada, a choice that supports Canadian farmers, lowers costs for Canadian families, and accelerates the country's transition to a green economy. It must be presented as a move that strengthens rather than weakens the nation's autonomy. By demonstrating an ability to de escalate a trade dispute and secure a tangible victory for its people, the government can make a powerful case that a smart, independent foreign policy is also a successful one. This approach also directly confronts the outdated logic of protectionism. Blocking competitors is a defensive crouch. Actively seeking partnerships and investment to build new domestic industries is a confident step forward. This is the definition of a modern industrial strategy. So, faced with these damaging consequences, Canada has been offered a clear path out of the impasse. The commentary from analysts and industry leaders alike is coalescing around a single pragmatic conclusion: Canada should take the deal. Negotiating with China to lift the retaliatory canola tariffs in exchange for removing the EV tariff is not an act of surrender. It is an act of strategic self interest. It is an opportunity to staunch the economic bleeding of the agricultural sector, deliver immediate benefits to consumers, and signal a pivot towards a more independent and agile foreign policy. However, the most visionary path forward involves looking beyond the immediate transaction and seizing the larger opportunity that this moment presents. Simply opening the market to Chinese EV imports is a good first step, but a far more ambitious and transformative strategy would be to invite Chinese automakers to build their vehicles in Canada. This is not a far fetched idea. It is a strategic pivot that leverages all of Canada's inherent strengths. Instead of viewing Chinese manufacturing as a threat, Canada could reframe it as a partnership. The country possesses vast reserves of the raw materials essential for the green revolution: lithium, aluminum, cobalt, and other rare earth minerals are abundant within its borders. It has a highly skilled and educated workforce with a deep history in automotive manufacturing, particularly in provinces like Ontario. Furthermore, Canada has a global reputation as a stable, transparent, and reliable place to do business, governed by the rule of law. By inviting Chinese EV companies to establish manufacturing plants on Canadian soil, the government could create a powerful synergy. These plants would use Canadian resources and Canadian labor to build cars for the North American and global markets. Imagine a future where electric vehicles stamped with Made in Canada are exported around the world, vehicles born from a collaboration that combines Chinese technological innovation with Canadian industrial capacity. This approach would turn a potential competitor into a partner, creating thousands of high paying jobs, stimulating local economies, and positioning Canada as a leader in the green industrial revolution. This is how a smart, forward thinking nation protects its industries in the 21st century, not by building tariff walls, but by building transformative partnerships. It is a vision that moves beyond the reactive, defensive posture of the past and embraces a future of proactive, collaborative growth. Such a strategy would demonstrate to the world that Canada understands how to balance competition with cooperation, turning a trade standoff into a catalyst for a new era of industrial prosperity. Ultimately, the choice facing Canada is about so much more than just tariffs on canola and electric vehicles. It is a fundamental test of its national character and its willingness to act as a truly sovereign nation in a world increasingly defined by the gravitational pull of economic superpowers. The historical pattern is undeniable. Every time Canada ties its economic fate exclusively to the political whims of Washington, it ends up on the losing end of the deal. From softwood lumber to steel and aluminum, the United States has consistently prioritized its own interests, hitting first and offering apologies or not later. Canada, in turn, has often responded with symbolic countermeasures, quietly absorbing the economic losses as the necessary cost of maintaining the alliance. This time, however, the dynamic is different. This time, Canada holds significant leverage. China's offer is not a plea, it is a pragmatic proposal rooted in mutual need. China requires a reliable supply of Canadian canola to feed its population, and Canadian consumers and climate goals would greatly benefit from access to affordable EVs. This symmetry creates a rare window of opportunity for Canada to negotiate from a position of strength and secure a deal that works unequivocally for its own people. To follow Washington's lead once more would be to condemn the country to another decade of reactive policy, perpetually vulnerable to the shifting tides of American politics. To lead for itself, however, would be to shape a future defined by its own priorities and its own interests. The world is watching what Canada decides next. This decision will send a powerful signal about its role in the new global order. Will it remain a pawn in someone else's economic war, sacrificing its own farmers and industries on the altar of a one sided alliance? Or will it take control of its own destiny? Lifting the EV tariffs is not an act of concession to Beijing, it is an act of liberation from Washington. It is a declaration that Canada will no longer allow its trade policy to be dictated by another nation's political agenda. It is a statement that it will fight for its farmers, for its consumers, and for its economic independence. Washington will not save Canadian jobs, and Beijing will not hand out opportunities for free. Canada must build its own future, and that construction begins with sovereign decisions like this one. The next great global conflicts may not be fought with armies, but with trade policies and strategic economic choices. In this arena, the decision to take the deal is not just smart economics, it is an assertion of national identity.